Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Art Forum. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Sequeira. I'm the director of the Margaret Lawrence Gallery, and I'm also the person who puts together the Art Forum program, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. And before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm situated, and I invite you to consider the traditional custodians of the land on which you're situated. For us here, it's I acknowledge the Bunwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Greater Kulin Nation. And for generations before the VCA was thought of, or the University of Melbourne was thought of, song and dance, paintings, sculpture, stories were shared on this land. And these rituals continue today. And it really is with joy that I pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. Our guest speaker, Gabriella Hirst, was born and grew up on Cammeraygal land, and is currently living between Burley and London. Actually, she's situated in Sydney right now, but without COVID, she normally lives between Burley and London. Gabriella works primarily with moving image, performance, and with the garden as a site of critique and care. Gabriella's practice and research explores connections between various manifestations of capture and control, spanning plant taxonomies, landscape painting, art conservation, and nuclear history. Gabriella recently launched Darling Darling, the 2020 ACMI Ian Potter Moving Image Commission. This work is currently on show at the Art Gallery of New South Wales as part of the National 2021. Gabriella is currently an associate lecturer in media studies with the Royal College of Art, School of Architecture in London. Wherever you are, please make Gabriella Hirst very welcome.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you so much for having me here. So I would also love to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where I am currently working from, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to extend my respects to elders past and present. And I also wanted to preface this talk by saying that when I use the word Australia in this talk, as I will over and over again, I'm referring to unceded Aboriginal land, land where I'm privileged to be a guest. In my work and research, I talk about ecology and land management, and I wanted to preface this talk with just a recognition of the immense volumes of work being done that have always been done by First Nations people when it comes to care of country. To reintroduce myself, I'm Gabriella Hirst. I'm an artist. As David has said, I work with a vast range of media, but most recently, I've been focusing on moving image work. And I also have this kind of adjunct side of my practice, which is working with the garden as said, as a site of critique and care. I work with plants and and with organic matter. But today I'm going to mainly talk about my moving image practice and to pull out some of the threads which underpin my research, primarily focusing on a kind of unlearning of the romantic landscape tradition and unlearning of the romantic gaze, which forms a kind of theoretical backdrop to my work over recent years. And I'm going to talk mainly about the work that David mentioned, Darling Darling, which is a 2-screen moving image work. It's currently showing in at the Australian Centre of Moving Image and also at the Art Gallery of New South Wales as part of the National. If there's time, I'd like to also talk about an upcoming project which is called, in its various manifestations, An English Garden, Sub Rosa, and How to Make a Bomb. We'll see if there's time for that. But before I begin, I wanted to start with a work called Force Majeure, which I made in 2015. It was commissioned by ACCA, the Australian Centre of Contemporary Art. It also showed at Domain House. David put together a wonderful show at Domain House. And this work forms a kind of groundwork for a lot of the research and parts of my practice which has followed. Force majeure is a single screen moving image work. It's 15 minutes in duration. I filmed it on an island called Rügen in northern Germany. It's at the edge of the Baltic Sea. And it's a film performance of myself attempting to paint a kind of romantic landscape painting of the sea, or kind of stormy sea, whilst being prevented from doing so by the severity of the storm itself. So I'm going to just show you an excerpt of that to start with. So force majeure was made as a kind of response to what I understood to be a kind of absurd core aim of romantic landscape painting that I was trying to work through at the time. I was living in Germany at that time, and I was intrigued and kind of repelled by the romantic tradition, this kind of frenzied attempt of these painters, as I saw it to be, to confront what they perceived as, and I'm using these words with a large pinch of salt, kind of wild and sublime expanse, and this attempt to contain this said wilderness into a relatively small and rectangular frame, and just kind of the hubris of this activity. The premise of this act just seems so ridiculous to me. And force majeure, I see it as a work where I first started to actively scrutinize these acts of containment that I feel are key to Western art making traditions. As I said, I made this work while I was living in Germany. And as David said, I've been living in Europe between Germany and the UK for actually coming up to about 8 years. But throughout this time, I've often been looking back to the place where I am from, and where I received my kind of foundational art education. And other settler colonial projects. Painters such as von Guerard and William Charles Pigney, who I'll talk about later, in the 1800s keenly applied the themes, ideas, and visual tropes of this sublime romantic tradition to their depictions of inland Australia, as at the same time European pastoralists further invaded Indigenous lands away from the coastlines. So a white European male painter, such as Caspar David Friedrich, who I was referencing, I guess, in Force Majeure, because Rügen is the place where Caspar David Friedrich would go to paint. So a white male painter such as Caspar David Friedrich, confronted by a perceived vast, sublime, and importantly, seemingly or supposed to be uncultivated terrain, is one thing when that wilderness is the Baltic Sea or the Swiss Alps, but it's another thing entirely when that territory is the unceded lands of the oldest living culture in the world, whose rights to land are not being recognized and whose culture is being actively erased. And the application of the sentiments of the sublime, which operates on the premise of a confrontation with, as I said, an empty, uncultivated land, just serves in this case to further erase the fact that these lands were highly cultivated by the first peoples of this country. And to imagine and depict this terrain as empty is to perpetuate this cultural erasure. As we know, lying about the cultivation of land in Australia is one of this country's foundational fictions. And so as I kind of started to scrutinize this landscape tradition more and more, I started to feel and think that the application of the romantic sublime onto Indigenous lands is a pictorial application of terra nullius. And I don't see this as being something that just happened in the past in the paintings that are held within galleries, but these images filter into a kind of collective imagination of how country in Australia is viewed. It reappears in film, in postcards, in like, I always think that when I was making the work that I'm going to talk about, Darling, Darling, along the river, when in all the kind of accommodation and houses that we stayed in, there was this recurrence of calendars on the wall that would show seascapes, these romantic seascapes and these romantic landscape paintings. And it just reminded me and reinforced this idea that the idea of containing landscape in a sublime way is something that's deeply embedded within image making in a Western context and in Australia. There are, of course, aside from just kind of the trope of the sublime romantic, there are much more concrete ways in which painters were active perpetrators of processes of colonial dispossession in the late 1700s and 1800s. Painters, and you'll probably know this image that's up here of I guess a garden. Painters, and I'm using that word again with a large pinch of salt. Painters traveled on inland expeditions by European explorers or invaders and extracted images of the lands they traversed. And these images influenced decisions on whether that land was to be invaded for pastoral use. They were often employed by station owners to depict new pastoral stations, which would serve to create a visually archivable claim to land. And when we consider these histories and colonial paintings and their recurring visual aftershocks, we cannot dismiss the relationship between the history of art and land misuse as it carries on. In an ocular-centric culture, paintings and later camera images reframed land into a colonial archive for dispossession. If the depiction of land within the pictorial frame, a rectangular canvas, or in the case of what I'm usually using, a camera's sensor, has a direct relationship with the containment of land within a legal framework of dispossession, it also has a close and causal relationship with the containment of that land within physical structures. A painting's frame, in my research, precludes a fence to contain certain animals, imported animals, a wall or a weir to keep in an imported species or to hold in a slippery natural resource, the pictorial frame as a proprietal frame. And I'm explaining these kind of ideas and mapping out these connections, which to those of you who are kind of embedded within this theory, it would probably seem incredibly obvious. But for me, this is a really important part of my practice, trying to engage with this process of unlearning how this landscape tradition has informed my own way of seeing country, and to understand how image making in so-called Australia, whether that be with a camera or a map or a paintbrush, is entangled with a historical and ongoing dispossession and erasure of Indigenous culture and ecological disaster. I'm curious about ways in which these archival categories might be complicated through art practice rather than just a straight up perpetuation. So in my recent work and research, I've been thinking about water specifically and the containment of water specifically, water being a deviant form within the colonial imagination in need of containment and enforced visualization.
Hi everyone. I think Gabriella has had to jump off because the internet is a bit unstable. So just be patient and hopefully she'll be back on very soon.
Sorry about that. Back?
Yeah, you're back. You're back.
Is everyone else back?
Everyone else is back. I think, is your internet unstable, Gabriella? Is that what that is?
I've just switched it over to a different server, so hopefully that won't happen again.
Right.
Sorry, the vast joys of Zoom artist talks.
Disappear.
So are we back? Can you see that? Is that all good?
Yes, that is all good.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that, everybody. I'll just kind of carry on where I left off. So I was talking about these two bodies of water. And the first body of water is called Wiriwa or Lake George. And my memory of visiting Canberra, one of the most exciting things as a child about visiting Canberra was in glimpsing Wiriwa from the highway on the way to the city, because you never knew if it would be full or empty, and you were just waiting to turn around the bend to see what the lake would look like. It's what is called, and any kind of geographer or geographer out there will probably correct me in saying this completely incorrectly, but an endorheic lake, an endoeric lake, it's a fluctuating lake. It sometimes appears as a dry field and at other times as a full inland sea. And I think about Wiriwa as defying concrete visualization. In my mind, the image of this lake is unstable. It's like a hologram, which I can flick back and forth between full and empty. Wiriwa sits in direct contrast to another body of water, which is very close by to it in the center of Canberra, a constructed landscaped lake called Lake Burley Griffin, which is named after the architect who designed much of the city. In contrast, Lake Burley Griffin is stable. It can be consistently viewed from Parliament House, much like the lakes in the vast landscape properties of the British gentry can be viewed as key water features in their vast estates. Lake Burley Griffin is stable, it is consistent, it always stays looking full, not like the dynamic Wiriwa, whose visual and physical dynamism sits as a provocation to the city, which is also the seat of power some kilometers away. But of course, bodies of water on the so-called Australian continent are so often more like Wiriwa rather than the consistent Lake Burley Griffin. They are dynamic. And in here, I wanted to quote the writer and curator J. Arthur in writing about clarifying the ambiguous landscape. She puts this so perfectly when she says, in pre-occupation Australia, the boundaries between land and water are dynamic. Rivers appear above ground and then disappear. They vary greatly in their widths. Anna branches, billabongs are left as evidence of this changing pattern. Chains of ponds, a typical pre-occupation creek system, disrupts the European concept of a continuing watercourse. Wetlands make an indistinct border. A flood out is one way a river moves from being water to being land. Banker, invented very early in the occupation, is an Australian English term used to describe an event uncommon in English rivers, but very common in Australian rivers. A river flooded to its bank. In pre-occupation Australia, the edges of land, as opposed to water or water to land, are ambiguous. This ambiguity has been a source of confoundment and frustration to the colonial pastoral project from the point of invasion in 1788 onwards. Efforts to seek out, contain, and capture bodies of water are key elements of the constructed Australian national mythology. An example being the multiple Australian expeditions into inland Australia in search of a fabled inland sea. That sea may exist, but in forms which sit at odds with the European colonial imagination of a set, visualizable body of water. For example, it could be a vast subterranean artesian basin, which you cannot see on the surface of country, or it could be Kaditanda, Lake Eyre, another expansive inland enteric lake. And I find it really interesting, just as a side note, that whenever I've traveled around Australia on Google Maps, these dynamic bodies of water in Australia will appear as set pale blue dots, which may work for navigating somewhere in Europe and looking for bodies of water in Europe, but in Australia just isn't appropriate. So if you see this image that shows Lake Wiriwa, it's of course always this very pale blue dot, whether or not it's empty or full. So this image that I'm showing here next was painted in 1860 on one such ill-fated inland expedition in search of this vast mythical inland sea led by Burke and Wills, and the painting is done by Ludwig Becker. This river that's depicted is the Barker, as it is called by the traditional owners of this country, the Barkindji. Combined with its tributaries, the Barker is the longest river in Australia. Upstream are the Brewarrina fish traps, which display one of the oldest feats of advanced hydrological engineering of the world. This is a fluctuating river system. Water levels fall and they rise, and when they rise, they flood, something which is absolutely vital for the health of this river system. As another dynamic body of water whose floods and droughts were viewed as chaos by European settlers in the late 1800s. The Barker has been subjected to processes of containment by European cultural and pictorial systems since the 1800s, and this image by Becker is one such representation of an early European pictorial containment of the fluctuating Barker River. The European Australian artist and surveyor, William Charles Pigney, a man who wore both hats of being a container through surveying and a container through being a landscape artist, visited the Barker region during what were in kind of the cities called catastrophic floods in 1890, and as a result painted this image, The Flood of the Darling, 1890. So this painting, which I grew up visiting the Art Gallery of New South Wales and visiting and kind of just being quite enthralled by it. It is thoroughly influenced by romantic pictorial tropes. It confines the floodwaters which overwhelm pastoralists, and it confines these waters, these through imagery into this neat gilded frame. The painting at the time was lauded, and it was immediately acquired by the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where it is still one of the most prized paintings in the gallery. It hangs in the old halls. After this flood, and after the painting plans were set in motion, after this flood and after the painting, plans were slowly but surely set in motion to develop physical containment structures to manage the floods of the fluctuating Barker-Darling River system. And over the following decades, the Barker-Darling has been transformed to meet the demands of agricultural and mining industries. Water has been diverted, pumped, lakes have been drained and contained, floodplains have been leveled so as to become easy catchments for flood waters. And this has obviously been very much in the news over the last couple of years, the mainstream news, due to predominantly these vast fish kills that have happened. But also, you might know this image. This is an image of Cubby Station, which is a vast upstream cotton farm. The cotton farms upstream with these large monocultural croplands store catchments of water from the floodplains that they harvest this flood water, equivalent to about 3 times Sydney Harbour minimum to sustain these very thirsty and climate unsuitable mass cash crops and restrict that water going down in downstream flows. And today, what remains of Australia's longest river is plagued by mass algae blooms and what I mentioned, these giant fish kills. When I visited Wilcannia for the first time in 2019, communities were receiving drinking water via a new tributary of boxed water trucked in from the coasts, which to me just seems like a truly horrifying result of a deviant body of water thoroughly controlled into small fragments of boxed water. In recent years, Barkindji were granted native title to the river, but tellingly they were not granted rights to the water itself. Despite being frequently bone dry, the Barker's vital wetlands, the Menindee Lakes, continue to show up as static patches of blue on Google Maps, much like Rewa near Canberra. And whilst over recent decades, the Barker itself, Australia's longest river, connected to some of the oldest examples of human engineering in the world and communities whose culture and lives depend on regular flows, continue to be actively destroyed for profit, W.C. Piggony's masterwork, The Flood of the Darling 1890, an object showing the river in full health, a work painted at the brink of perhaps even heralding the river's destruction, has been held in the softly lit, climate-controlled old halls of the Art Gallery, New South Wales, since its purchase in 1899. So I guess kind of to sum up my ideas on that, colonial patriarchal capitalism seeks to contain dynamic bodies of water, bodies which leak outside of their archival categories, whether these bodies be geographical bodies of water or human bodies, social bodies and objects. And in this case, a painting, a body as a painting, which was starting to show signs of its age after so long in this gallery, despite the climate control. The care of maintaining the image of the Barker Darling in flood is an expensive endeavour. For the major restoration, which happened in 2012, the process was funded by a sizable and publicly celebrated grant from the Bank of America Merrill Lynch. They chose Piggony's Flood of the Darling painting as a national treasure, declaring that it should be preserved for future generations. And I just was looking online at the Bank of America Merrill Lynch's more recent 2014, the Bank of America Lynch released a prime bill, which I just found was somehow very telling. Which brings me to Darling Darling, my most recent moving image project. I just wanted to check that my internet is staying stable. Could someone give me a heads up? I apologize for these ups and downs.
Yes, it's stable.
Okay, fantastic.
It was a little bit patchy a moment ago, but you're back on nice and clear now.
Okay, fingers crossed that stays. Right. So Darling Darling, as the work is titled, is a 2-channel film installation with 2 films playing simultaneously back to back, with sound from both films leaking into the image of one another. The film on one side shows footage of the Barker as it is today, in the state that it is today, in a series of shots which progress as if from dawn to dusk. And each shot is composed, framed, and graded so as to somehow emulate some of the tropes of European landscape painting. At the same time as this, another film plays on the direct opposite side of the screen. And this film depicts the careful and costly conservation of Piggony's Flood of the Darling 1890, as performed by the hidden hands of the gallery conservation staff. I filmed on Barkindji country in 2019, a place where I have visited several times. I'm always there as a visitor and as a very grateful guest. I was very lucky and fortunate to be advised in the making of this work by Barkindji elder, artist and activist, Uncle Badger Bates, who guided me on what I should be looking out for and evidencing in my film, which I myself wouldn't have noticed, such as in this shot, the mussels in the low left corner, which are evidence that the mussels gather in the parts of the river that are the deepest, that should never, ever go dry. And so seeing such a vast amount of mussels that are exposed like this is evidence that this is just not kind of, as I guess certain press would call, just like regular natural rising and flowing of, which kind of brings to mind this kind of discourse about climate change, that it's just a natural flow, but this is actually a really significant issue. And I also was advised on where not to film. And I spoke to Uncle Badger before this talk. And whilst there, some of you might know, there have recently been significant flows from northern floods into the Menindee Lakes. These flows, whilst being very welcome and needed, are of course cosmetic. The structural problems facing the river remain the same. And he reminded me to pass on the following message. This is with respects to Uncle Badger. The following quote is, "The Darling Barker must flow like the blood in our bodies. All rivers must flow like the blood in our veins." The installation, that's the end of the quote. The installation makes active use of leakage, specifically sound leakage, in an attempt to create a kind of brief collapse between image and environment, and to have the space of the gallery as a space where the ideas about leakage and the river leakage might kind of be played out as the audience kind of circulates around the space. The installation in this way is important. And as you can kind of see in this imagery, there's two sides. There's someone watching the film on one side and someone watching the film on the other. And in terms of thinking about leakage, I've been thinking about Astrida Naimanis's writings on hydrofeminism and how she draws on Mark and Diana McMenonen's theory of the hypersea, a body of water which is constantly in motion and which inhabits and is inhabited by, through their bodies, all beings. We live in water, water passes through us, and we pass through gestational waters. Even whilst in constant motion, water is a planetary archive of meaning and matter. Water is not contained within, but passes through bodies. I'm going to show a short excerpt of the film, which shows the work formatted as a side-to-side screener. Whereas, of course, as you can see, the installation, in the installation, you'd never see both films at the same time. The film was shot on Barkindji country and Gadigal country, and on the advice of a consultant. I'd like to give a heads up that the footage, as per this image that I've already shown, and apologies for not saying this beforehand, but the footage that I'm showing of the Barker shows the river in a state of devastation, which could be distressing for some videos, especially those for whom this is their country. So I'm just going to stop share and put that on for a few minutes. Right. Also, just please excuse the time codes that are in this. This is from kind of an earlier draft of the film. So that's just a very short excerpt of Darling Darling, but I'm aware of time. So if you are in Naarm, then or in New South Wales, it's on at the Art Gallery of New South Wales and at ACMI at the moment. Seems like a bit of a cop out, but anyway. Right. So I'm just going to kind of add a couple of notes about the other side. I've talked a lot about the river, but I wanted to talk briefly about art conservation, and then I'll kind of wrap up. But so I've been interested in painting conservation for quite a while. I'm really interested in kind of the ideology of creating stillness and in kind of enforcing stasis. I am really interested in this anecdote about this painting on the left, which is the Venus of Rokeby, painted by Velázquez and held within the National Gallery in London. And in 1914, the suffragette Mary Richardson went into the gallery and slashed the painting to draw focus to the actual treatment of female bodies as part of the suffragette plight. And what I find interesting about that further is that after this action, the painting was really meticulously restored and pulled together. And when I went to the National Gallery in 2018, I somehow expected that history of that painting would be evidenced, but it's so perfectly restored that the only way that you can see any trace of that action is if you get right down next to the painting and look from the side. You can see the light glancing off and there's these very minor scars, but there's no information about that action in the surrounding text. And I just found that really interesting about what stories are being contained by a painting or left out of the way in which a painting is experienced by audiences as a physical object. And I started thinking, I guess, a lot about how the way in which paintings are held and maintained is so much about like what bodies are allowed in the gallery and what bodies are not allowed in the gallery or within the frame. And whilst working with the conservators at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, they were telling me about how so much of the dust that's in the gallery is actually dust that falls off people who walk through the gallery, or of course, like the people who work there, the invigilators, the staff. And yet it's this constant kind of upkeep of keeping bodies of water, bodies in general outside of the frame, and this general kind of constant labor and upkeep. And I've made kind of other work, which is about this. I made a work called Interlude in 2018, thinking about the Velázquez painting, in which it's kind of a performative action where I enter into the kind of filmed frame. It's a film performance, and I have a sheet over myself, and I just kind of assume the form of a chair very slowly, and someone coming across this film might see, depending on when they enter the space, they might see it as an object or they might see it as like a hidden subject, and there's this slippage back and forth. And so I've been thinking about these things, about stilling and about the hidden body for a really long time. So it was a real privilege to be able to actually, in the making of Darling Darling, to be able to be allowed behind the scenes of a conservation department at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I worked with these three amazing conservators, Paula Dredge, Andrea Nottage, and Barbara Dobrova, who actually restaged. That's kind of, I don't know how important that really is for the work. I'm still kind of unpacking that, but they restaged the conservation for me completely. So there's this kind of strange performative element to the work. And we had so many interesting conversations throughout the course of developing this work together. And the idea of what it means to kind of critique something like, in the way that this work seems to be doing, showing care or lack of care, what it means to kind of be wrapped up in that. And I guess I see myself as also part of this vast mechanism of containment within a Western art structure, much like other art workers, like art conservators, just that whole kind of world. I see myself wrapped up in that. But of course, there's a kind of complicated power dynamic that I'm the one with the camera and I'm the one telling the narrative. So we had a lot of conversations about that. And I'm still kind of unpacking where I sit within that and where my position of power and authorship is with that. one really interesting thing that I learned through working with the conservators was about why conservation of so many paintings needs to happen. And it's because paintings are so often, like, traditionally constructed in layers, and underneath the bottom layer is the canvas, this very organic matter, and then on top of that there's the primer, and then on top of that there's these pigments, which interestingly in the case of Darling Darling are all these pigments that have the names of European cities, like Prussian blue, or European places, English red, Venetian yellow, and also of minerals, titanium and ochre, and these kind of names which speak, in this strange way to kind of the colonial project in Australia as well. And then on top of that layer of pigments, there's this quite brittle varnish layer. And much of conservation is about removing that varnish layer and replacing it. Because even though the gallery space is this kind of climate controlled area, that one of the biggest problems is that there's humidity that can't be contained, despite the fact that there's these humidity regulators. And so that very soft layer underneath, that strata of canvas, can expand and contract as humidity moves into that painting. And the more brittle layer on top will be kind of burst at the seams as it kind of tries to move with that fluctuation. And I find that really interesting to think about, that the painting as holding these kind of geographical structures underneath, that there's this kind of artesian basin of water of the painting itself that is constantly leaking outside of the frame, and the conservator's job is in a way to continue to dam that water into the painting, and therefore keep the kind of pictorial space of this flood, in the case of Pekingese flood of the Darling, to keep that pictorial space whole and contained, and to stop both visual and like physical leakage. And I just think that's really interesting in terms of thinking of what I said before about the hypersea, that water is constantly flowing in and out of bodies. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, that's kind of the sum of what I was thinking about with Darling Darling and where I am now. It's been a really protracted project because of COVID. It has taken about 2 years to make, when it was supposed to take about 1 year. So I've had a lot of time to be thinking about these things and unpicking certain kind of elements of the project and working through these ideas. A lot of these ideas I don't think come up straight away for someone in the gallery space, but the film is about 25 minutes. So about 50 minutes if you're going to see both sides, and it's very slow. It's very contemplative. The films are supposed to form that relationship with paintings. You're supposed to sit with them and be implicated in the gaze as a viewer. And so I would hope that someone spending time with the work might actually have time to pull out some of these ideas or other ideas that I, of course, just have never considered myself. I don't think there's time for me to talk about the next project that I'm working on, even briefly. But I will say that it is a work that I will be stepping away from the screen for a while, which will be nice. I'm sure a lot of you, even though you're very kindly listening on a screen today, will be very happy to have to be doing things with your hands, and to be stepping away from Zoom. So I won't be editing a film. I'm going to be making a garden that is, to put it very briefly, is made up. It's going to be in the UK, in Essex. It's opening in about a month. It's an English garden, and it's constructed mainly of a type of rose that I've been propagating for the last 2 years. That is a very strangely named rose called the Rose of Floribunda Atom Bomb. It was made in the 1950s in this time of quite grotesque. Well, it seems very grotesque now, and I think it just is quite grotesque. Fascination with nuclear technologies and the same kind of dynamic, the same kind of naming process that came about with calling the bikini swimsuit is named after the Bikini Atoll tests, this kind of fascination with nuclear technologies in the 50s. So I have this rose that bears the scar of this particular time in history. And by propagating this almost extinct rose and making this English garden, I'm hoping to kind of bring discourses about how nuclear culture is not something that just happened in the past, that we still continue to live in a world that is dominated and controlled by nuclear weaponry, nuclear diplomacy, and that also that anything to do with nuclear doesn't just sit within a neat time bubble. It links back, when we're talking about Australia, we can't talk about nuclear culture, of course, without considering the British attempts at Maralinga that in the 1950s on unceded Indigenous lands that caused so much devastation. That the British, and I guess that's one of the things I'm talking about with the British garden, the English garden, to think about ideas of gardening the world. So yeah, I think that's probably all I have time for. Is that right, David? I can talk for hours. I should probably stop.
Yeah, I think that was so great to get that perspective on, you know, particularly those two works, because one of the things that struck me thinking about your work and listening to you was that the projects, what we see in the gallery is actually the tip of the iceberg compared to the thinking and the process and the consultation and the rethinking and the reimagining. You know, that it's very interesting for me I mean, of course, those ideas are in the work, and the work's integrity relies on that depth of research. But it's really great to hear you talk about that and developing relationships with custodians, not just, you know, like there are the custodians of the land, but like you could consider conservators as custodians of works of art.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And that sort of custodianship has very much changed over time. It used to be much more aggressive, but it's become a lot more about reversibility, which I think is something really interesting in that practice. Yeah.
So look, there are two questions that have come in, and one of them is, what does film allow that painting does not?
It's a really good question, and I don't know whether I have a set answer for it, because I guess with using film, I'm just kind of trying to unpack a bit of that question. I see film as a kind of direct follow on from painting, and I use film to talk about painting and to talk about framing. I guess one thing I would say, that even just as a gesture, film allows like an illusion of dynamism. It allows an illusion, or at least it allows a space to critique the lack of dynamism and when I say dynamism, I'm talking about a kind of the stuff that I talked about before about movement and flow and flux. It allows for me a critique of that lack of dynamism that is within painting and within kind of the structures of containment that the painting project, the pastoral project, that is part of that. It allows for a gesture towards leakiness, I think, or at least it allows us to think about leakiness. It allows me to think about leakiness.
I got it. And the last question, I guess it's a more personal question. What had you moved to the UK and Berlin?
Originally?
Yeah, it was like 8 years, right?
Yeah, I just got an opportunity. There are so many or there used to be, so many of these opportunities for like young Australian artists to go over, and I got an opportunity to do a residency in Paris at the Cité des Arts, and I took this opportunity, and whilst I was fascinated by it, I had a fantastic time. But I did spend a lot of time there being like, it is quite interesting and funny that I'm being given this, what seemed like an opportunity to go away and like learn about art, like with a big capital A. And I don't know, that there was something, maybe because of the position, the residency itself, it was like, it's right in the center of Paris. It's got this kind of history behind it. But yeah, I did start immediately kind of questioning, like, what does it mean for me to be here and for me to be given resources to be able to be here? But yeah, I went over there and things just kind of, I got more funding. Funding allowed me to do it. I think that's it. I had resources to go over there and stay over there. And then you start to build relationships, you start to build friendships, and yeah. that's why.
Yes, I mean, the reason, I guess when I hear that question, I'm thinking about, particularly with Darling, where, you're considering an Australian landscape at a distance, you're actually living in the UK. There's another layer of, another lens actually through which to consider some of the issues in your work. I mean, I'm just wondering if that's,
I mean, when I left Australia, I felt like there was a lot of discourse around this gaze back, this gaze. I mean, I think there has been for a long time, and I think it's, it's also dwindling. And there's so many complications of that gaze, the gaze between somewhere like the UK and Australia. But when I left originally, that was very kind of key in discourses. And then I was implicated in it myself. I was over there and I was missing home and all my family are here. And so I was looking back and I was thinking about distance, and I was really enjoying my time over there and building a kind of life and a community, but knowing that I was looking back. And then when I'm here, I'm looking over there. So I feel kind of personally tied up in this gaze that has this very long and fraught history. So it is kind of weirdly personal for me. Yeah.
I get it. Well, Gabriella, thank you so much for your generosity today. Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us the way that you have, but also a big congratulations to you on Darling and its presentation both in Melbourne and Sydney simultaneously. And we look forward to the new project, The Garden, and thank you to everyone who's joined us from wherever you are, and we look forward to you joining us again next week for Art Forum. So thanks everyone, and goodbye.
Thanks for having me.